Chapter 5 Kingdoms, Kings, and an Early Republic. Election Day. Shankaran woke up to see his grandparents all ready to go and vote. They wanted to be the first to reach the polling booth. Why? Shankaran wanted to know. Were they so excited? Somewhat impatiently, his grandfather explained, "We can choose our own rulers today." How some men became rulers. Choosing leaders or rulers by voting is something that has become common during the last 50 years or so. How did men become rulers in the past? Some of the Rajas we read about in chapter 4 were probably chosen by the Jana, the people. But around 3000 years ago, we find some changes taking place in the ways in which Rajas were chosen. Some men now became recognized as Rajas by performing very big sacrifices. The Ashwamedha, or horse sacrifice, was one such ritual. A horse was let loose to wander freely, and it was guarded by the Raja's men. If the horse wandered into the kingdoms of other Rajas and they stopped it, they had to fight. If they allowed the horse to pass, it meant that they accepted that the Raja who wanted to perform the sacrifice was stronger than them. These Rajas were then invited to the sacrifice, which was performed by specially trained priests, who were rewarded with gifts. The Raja who organized the sacrifice was recognized as being very powerful, and all those who came brought gifts for him. The Raja was the central figure in those rituals. He often had a special seat, a throne, or a tiger skin. His charioteer, who was his companion in the battlefield and witnessed his exploits, chanted tales of his glory. His relatives, especially his wives and sons, had to perform a variety of minor rituals. The other Rajas were simply spectators who had to sit and watch the performance of the sacrifice. Priests performed the rituals, including the sprinkling of sacred water on the king. The ordinary people, the Vish or Vaishya, also brought gifts. However, some people, such as those who were regarded as Shudras by the priests, were excluded from many rituals. Make a list of all those who would be present at a sacrifice. Which are the categories that are described in terms of their occupation? Varnas. We have many books that were composed in North India, especially in the areas drained by the Ganga and the Yamuna during this period. These books are often called later Vedic because they were composed after the Rig Veda, about which you learnt in chapter 4. These include the Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharva Veda, as well as other books. These were composed by priests and described how rituals were to be performed. They also contained rules about society. There were several different groups in society at this time: priests and warriors, farmers, herders, traders, craftspersons, laborers, fishing folk, and forest people. Some priests and warriors were rich, as were some farmers and traders. Others, including many herders, craftspersons, laborers, fishing folk, and hunters and gatherers, were poor. The priests divided people into four groups, called Varnas. According to them, each Varna had a different set of functions. The first Varna was that of the Brahmin. Brahmins were expected to study and teach the Vedas, perform sacrifices, and receive gifts. In the second place were the rulers, also known as Kshatriyas. They were expected to fight battles and protect people. Third were the Vish or the Vaishyas. They were expected to be farmers, herders, and traders. Both the Kshatriyas and the Vaishyas could perform sacrifices. Last were the Shudras, who had to serve the other three groups and could not perform any rituals. Often, women were also grouped with the Shudras. Both women and Shudras were not allowed to study the Vedas. The priests also said that these groups were decided on the basis of birth. For example, if one's father and mother were Brahmins, one would automatically become a Brahmin, and so on. Later, they classified some people as untouchable. These included some craftspersons, hunters and gatherers, as well as people who helped perform burials and cremations. The priests said that contact with these groups was polluting. Many people did not accept the system of Varna laid down by the Brahmins. Some kings thought they were superior to the priests. Others felt that birth could not be a basis for deciding which Varna people belonged to. Besides, some people felt that there should be no differences amongst people based on occupation. Others felt that everybody should be able to perform rituals. And others condemned the practice of untouchability. Also, there were many areas in the subcontinent, such as the Northeast, where social and economic differences were not very sharp and where the influence of the priests was limited. Why did people oppose the system of Varnas? Janapadas. The Rajas who performed these big sacrifices were now recognized as being Rajas of Janapadas rather than Janas. The word Janapada literally means the land where the Jana set its foot and settled down. Some important Janapadas are shown on map 4. Snippet on the left, painted graveware. Plates and bowls are the most common vessels made out of painted graveware. These are extremely fine to touch with a nice smooth surface. Perhaps these were used on special occasions for important people and to serve special food. Archaeologists have excavated a number of settlements in these Janapadas, such as Purana Kila in Delhi, Hastinapura near Meerut, and Artanjikera near Etah. The last two are in Uttar Pradesh. They found that people lived in huts and kept cattle as well as other animals. They also grew a variety of crops rice, wheat, barley, pulses, sugarcane, sesame, and mustard. Is there a crop in this list that was not mentioned in Chapter 3? They made earthen pots. Some of these were grey in color, others were red. One special type of pottery found at these sites is known as painted greyware. As is obvious from the name, these grey pots had painted designs, usually simple lines and geometric patterns. Mahajanapadas. About 2500 years ago, some Janapadas became more important than others and were known as Mahajanapadas. Some of these are shown on map 4. Most Mahajanapadas had a capital city. Many of these were fortified. This means that huge walls of wood, brick, or stone were built around them. Forts were probably built because people were afraid of attacks from other kings and needed protection. It is also likely that some rulers wanted to show how rich and powerful they were by building really large, tall, and impressive walls around their cities. Also, in this way, the land and the people living inside the fortified area could be controlled more easily by the king. Building such huge walls required a great deal of planning. Thousands, if not lakhs, of bricks or stones had to be prepared. This in turn meant enormous labor provided, possibly by thousands of men, women, and children, and resources had to be found for all of this. The fortification wall at Kaushambi. This is a picture of remains of a wall made of brick found near present day Allahabad, Uttar Pradesh. A part of it was probably built about 2500 years ago. The new Rajas now began maintaining armies. Soldiers were paid regular salaries and maintained by the king throughout the year. Some payments were probably made using punch marked coins. See the illustration on page 84. You will read more about these coins in chapter 8. List two ways in which the Rajas of the Mahajanapadas were different from those mentioned in the Rig Vedas. Taxes. As the rulers of the Mahajanapadas were A. building huge forts, B. maintaining big armies, they needed more resources, and they needed officials to collect these. So, instead of depending on occasional gifts brought by people, as in the case of the Raja of the Janapadas, they started collecting regular taxes. Taxes on crops were the most important. This was because most people were farmers. Usually, the tax was fixed at one-sixth of what was produced. This was known as bhaga or a share. There were taxes on craftspersons as well. These could have been in the form of labor. For example, a weaver or a smith may have had to work for a day every month for the king. Herders were also expected to pay taxes in the form of animals and animal produce. There were also taxes on goods that were bought and sold through trade, and hunters and gatherers also had to provide forest produce to the Raja. Changes in agriculture. There were two major changes in agriculture around this time. One was the growing use of iron plowshares. This meant that heavy clay soil could be turned over better than with a wooden plowshare so that more grain could be produced. Second, people began transplanting paddy. This meant that instead of scattering seed on the ground from which plants would sprout, saplings were grown and then planted in the fields. This led to increased production as many more plants survived. However, it was back-breaking work. Generally, slave men and women, dasas and dasis, and landless agricultural laborers, kamakaras, had to do this work. Can you think why kings would encourage these changes? A closer look. A. Magadha. Find Magadha on map 4. Magadha became the most important Mahajanapada in about 200 years. Many rivers such as the Ganga and Son flowed through Magadha. This was important for A. Transport, B. Water supplies, C. Making the land fertile. Parts of Magadha were forested. Elephants, which lived in the forest, could be captured and trained for the army. Forests also provided wood for building houses, carts, and chariots. Besides, there were iron ore mines in the region that could be tapped to make strong tools and weapons. Magadha had two very powerful rulers, Bimbisara and Ajatasattu, who used all possible means to conquer other Janapadas. Mahapadmananda was another important ruler. He extended his control up to the northwest part of the subcontinent. Rajagriha, present day Rajgir in Bihar, was the capital of Magadha for several years. Later, the capital was shifted to Pataliputra, present day Patna. More than 2300 years ago, a ruler named Alexander, who lived in Macedonia in Europe, wanted to become a world conqueror. Of course, he didn't conquer the world, but did conquer parts of Egypt and West Asia, and came to the Indian subcontinent, reaching up to the banks of the Bias. When he wanted to march further eastwards, his soldiers refused. They were scared, as they had heard that the rulers of India had vast armies of foot soldiers, chariots, and elephants. In what ways were these armies different from those described in the Rig Veda? A closer look. B. Vajji. When Magadha became a powerful kingdom, Vajji, with its capital at Vaishali in Bihar, was under a different form of government known as Gana or Sangha. In a Gana or a Sangha, there were not one but many rulers. Sometimes, even when thousands of men ruled together, each one was known as a Raja. These Rajas performed rituals together. They also met in assemblies and decided what had to be done and how through discussion and debate. For example, if they were attacked by an enemy, they met to discuss what should be done to meet the threat. However, women, dasas, and kamakaras could not participate in these assemblies. Both the Buddha and Mahavira, about whom you will read in chapter 6, belonged to Ganas or Sanghas. Some of the most vivid descriptions of life in the Sanghas could be found in Buddhist books. Snippet on the right. Gana is used for a group that has many members. Sangha means organization or association. This is an account of the Vajis from the Digha Nikaya, a famous Buddhist book which contains some of the speeches of the Buddha. These were written down about 2300 years ago. Ajatasattu and the Vajis. Ajatasattu wanted to attack the Vajis. He sent his minister named Vasakara to the Buddha to get his advice on the matter. The Buddha asked whether the Vajis met frequently in full assemblies. When he heard that they did, he replied that the Vajis would continue to prosper as long as they held full and frequent public assemblies. They met and acted together. They followed established rules. They respected, supported, and listened to elders. Vaji women were not held by force or captured. Chaityas, local shrines, were maintained in both towns and villages. Wise saints who followed different beliefs were respected and allowed to enter and leave the country freely. In what ways was the Vajji Sangha different from the other Mahajanapadas? Try and list at least three differences. Rajas of powerful kingdoms tried to conquer the Sanghas. Nevertheless, these lasted for a very long time till about 1500 years ago, when the last of the Ganas or Sangas were conquered by the Gupta rulers, about whom you will read in chapter 10. Elsewhere, find Greece and Athens in your atlas. Around 2500 years ago, the people of Athens set up a form of government which was called a democracy, which lasted for about 200 years. All free men over the age of 30 were recognized as full citizens. There was an assembly that met at least 40 times a year to decide on important matters. All citizens could attend these meetings. Appointments for many positions were made through lottery. All those who wanted to be chosen gave in their names, and then some were selected through lottery. Citizens were expected to serve in the army and the navy. However, women were not considered citizens. Also, many foreigners who lived and worked in Athens as merchants and craftspersons did not have rights as citizens. Besides, there were several thousand slaves in Athens who worked in mines, fields, households, and workshops. They too were not treated as citizens. Do you think this was a true democracy? Some important dates: 3000 years ago, new kinds of rajas. 2500 years ago, Mahajanapadas. About 2300 years ago, Alexander's invasion, composition of the Digha Nikaya. About 1500 years ago, end of the Ganas or Sangas.